So our next speaker is Allyn Whaley-Martin, the risk manager at Women's Hospital in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Previously, she was the project manager for the Hospital Preparedness Program at the Louisiana Hospital Association Research and Education Foundation. In this role, she worked directly with the ESF8 network, supporting collaborative planning and preparedness activities to support healthcare readiness for emergency events. Allyn will discuss lessons learned from the 2016 Great Flood in Louisiana. Please welcome Allyn Whaley-Martin.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for calling up this beautiful weather. I came to Massachusetts 2 years ago to speak to another group about our floods, and it rained, and it was cold, and it was miserable the whole time that I was here, so I really appreciate you taking care of me this time. So I am here to talk about our floods in Louisiana in 2016. 2016 was a pretty challenging year for us, but before I get there, I feel compelled to tell you a little bit about myself. I do have, from the bio that's in your program there, I do have a background in psychology. I hold a master's degree. I came to Louisiana to get my graduate degree, and I just have never seemed to leave. But I've had this interest in how do we learn and how do we retain information, and why is it that it works sometimes and other times. And when I started thinking about this presentation, I thought, oh, those concepts probably fit pretty well in here too. I mean, we've had a few turns in the barrel in Louisiana in terms of disaster response, and there's some things that we do really well, and that the lesson has stuck, and then there's some things that maybe we need to keep going back to that and figure out something else because we just haven't come up with the right solution. I do work for Women's Hospital. Women's is a specialty acute hospital in Louisiana. We are focused on the care of women and infants. That is our mission is to ensure and improve the health of those two groups of people in Louisiana and certainly beyond. Women's has been around since 1958. We are not a large hospital. We only have 168 licensed beds, but we do have an 83-bed level 3 NICU. We take care of some very fragile, tiny babies, and we tend to stay pretty full. We're a referral center, so we get a lot of babies from other parts of the state. We are busy. We do around 9,000 births a year, so we do bring a lot of babies into the world and expand our services there. During the 2016 floods, I was working for the Hospital Association. I served as that interface between our state level, our Department of Health, which is ESF8, and the hospitals. Our hospitals are organized into regions. We'll talk about that a little bit more there. But I also did work for another hospital where I was one of the designated regional coordinators as our system was developing. And so I have some insight in how do we build the system that we have today, how do we apply it as a healthcare facility, and then what does it mean within the context of a larger disaster. The next slide, please. Today I'm going to be talking primarily about 3 hospitals that were in the primary impact area of the floods. There are three locations there. The first is a freestanding emergency department. I don't know if you have that particular animal up here. In Louisiana, we have something that's, it is truly an emergency department. The way they work is they have to be licensed and attached to a general or acute hospital. So if the patient that they're seeing needs inpatient care, they have an easy avenue to get there. They are not urgent care centers. They are not doc in a box. They really and truly are emergency rooms. And this one actually had just been open since, I want to say 2011, so it's still fairly new on its campus. They have very robust outpatient service or ambulatory things, imaging, diagnostics, those kind of things that are there with the ED, but none of the other support services that you'd have with a full-service hospital. The second hospital is a full-service acute care hospital a little bit to the north of our hospital. We're hospital number 3 on this map. And they do also have a small ICU as well as a small neonatal ICU. They're one of the partners that we have for referring kids over to us. So that's the primary impact area. In this part of Louisiana, we have, I want to say, 22 or 23 hospitals as a whole. So it's just a subset of those. But we do all work together when it comes to disaster response, and I hope that you'll see that in the comments today. So this is an image. This is our Sunday paper on, I want to say it was August the 14th. So that was Sunday of the Great Floods. And I really just love the headline, State of Disaster. Not many places would actually call that out and tell people that their state is a disaster. But in Louisiana, we've had a good bit of experience. And I think by the time we got to this point in 2016, we were all just pretty tired. In addition to the big floods that we had in August, we had also had 2 previous floods in the northern part of the state with a high level of the Mississippi River, and it was flooding into mostly unpopulated areas, but still some effect in Shreveport and the Alexandria areas. In Baton Rouge alone, we had a police-involved shooting, then we had some related community violence and riots. And so truly, when we got to this flood, we were done. We just didn't want to talk about it anymore. So I thought it was funny, and that's one of my favorite images, I guess, of this disaster event. In case you're wondering, Louisiana has had a few turns in the disaster cycle. There is a website that you can go find to see how many federally declared disasters your state or territory has had. Louisiana, since 1953, has had 79. Most of those are natural disasters, hurricanes, flooding, those kind of things. And just in case you're curious, Massachusetts has had 50. So I don't know if that means we're winning or if you're winning. But either way, we've had a lot of experience within disaster, and I think that shows in how our process works. So if you show the next slide, the August 2016 flood was pretty impactful in Louisiana. Our state is organized into parishes, which are like your counties. We have 64 of them, and 27 parishes had enough initial damage to receive a state declaration to be declared as a disaster area. 22 of those reached the threshold to get to the federal declaration of disaster, which is a pretty high bar to meet. A lot of damage to property. The federal declaration helps you to understand the impact and the magnitude of the event. It was in there. Something that you can't see on this slide, but I'll show you in another one, is the impact of this was even more on a personal level. So a lot of the areas that flooded in this particular event were not designated flood zones by FEMA. So they weren't in that thing. And so there was the perception that you don't need flood insurance. And so most of the people didn't have it, which is very difficult as an individual to have none of that support that's available for you. And as a state, I think we've had to work really hard to be able to get them some support after the fact. So on the next slide, you'll see a timeline of the flood as it occurred in August of 2016. This slide starts with August the 11th, but in truth, we actually had flooding. We had heavy rainfall and serious storms a couple of days before that. And what set us up for this flood was the 2 or 3 previous weeks. We had 2 to 3 days of really heavy rain, and then it would ease up and we'd have a beautiful weekend, and then it would pour down rain on us again. The consequence of that is all of our natural drainage systems were full. There was no place for the water to go. And that combined with the development in this area and just the state of things, that's what got us into this flood, that we hadn't seen these level of flooding for more than 30 years in this part of the state. So starting off with August the 11th, I wanted to show you this. And so the storm really, in Louisiana, we pay a lot of attention to the weather, particularly in the months from June to November, because that's hurricane season. So we're all attuned to the weather, but what we're listening for is important. This storm never got a name. It wasn't identified as a tropical storm. It wasn't something that hit our radar as something that we really needed to start to worry about. And so I think honestly, once we got to this part of the storm, is we were just thinking, oh my God, it's another 2 to 3 days of rain, and it'll ease off, and we'll just have a lovely weekend after that. Our parish and our state emergency operations centers were monitoring it, but nobody was waving the flag to say, we really need to get ready and something's a little bit different here. So on the next slide, and I'll show you just as an example, this is my friend Tommy. He is our director of facilities at Women's Hospital, and you can tell by the look on his face that he's just having a good time. Really and truly, he's here, he's showing showing a little bit of water inundation on our campus. And so you know he's not worried about this. He's been through a number of hurricanes, and he's not thinking that this is anything more than just a little extra water on our campus. So as a point of context, our hospital, while we've been around since 1958, we've been in this particular location only since 2012. So this was really the first big challenge that we had when we were in this spot. And our hospital was built on the land that was a former golf course. It is an absolutely beautiful location, but it's just the way the city has developed over the last 10 to 15 years. So as a consequence, when you have a lovely golf course, you have all this green space, and that's where water can kind of percolate into the system and it can drain off. Well, our campus added a lot of non-permeable space, right? We put this big building and lots of parking and these support things. And so our campus was actually designed with some retaining ponds with the intent to do some water management and to be able to manage some of this stuff so it didn't affect our property or the properties around us. So this is actually one of the retaining ponds, and these are the drainage systems. Our ponds drain into some bayous that are nearby, so that it gets into the natural draining system. And you'll notice that the water is a little bit high there. Typically, you can see almost all of the drain pipe. You can't necessarily see this. And so we're watching the water come up. And this is actually on Friday, August the 12th. So it's been raining pretty heavily for the last couple of days. We're watching the water kind of inch up into our retaining ponds. And we're starting to think, maybe this is something that we need to pay a little closer attention to. Because it's a Friday, we're going into a weekend. I remember the conversation that we had at the Emergency Operations Center. He said, well, let's just ask our hospitals what their capacity is. Let's just kind of do a little level check and just kind of see what's going on out there. And so we issued a request for what we call a bed poll. We have some systems in place where we ask hospitals to give us a snapshot. What's your capacity right now? How many open beds do you have? Are you having any trouble with any of your utilities? Just to get a little lay of the land. And let's just see what's going on with that. So our hospital looked at that, and we were feeling pretty good. Again, we're all thinking that the water's going to go down in the next day. We felt like our resources were more than adequate. We are going into the weekend, and our weekend staffing tends to be a little less than during the week, but we really didn't see that as an issue. So when I'll show you the next slide, we maybe started to rethink our challenge, or rethink our position a little bit more. So I hope this is really cute. So if you can show me the next slide that's there. So the rain continues to fall, and from Friday to Saturday, I'd love to show you this. This is actually another one of those drainage. It's a little bit further to the south from the one that I showed you in the beginning. And yes, that guy really is fishing there. But what I wanted to show you, what's important, is how much higher the water got in just a few hours. It was really coming down. There were estimates that we were getting 2 to 3 inches of rain an hour, which is just buckets and buckets of rain, and it just didn't seem to let up at all. Our hospital, we looked at our capacity again. We were around our normal census. We had 63, 64 kids in the NICU. Our adult census is right around 90 to 100, so it wasn't terrible. We had a little bit of flex that was in there, but we were starting to get a little concerned about this level of water that's coming up and these people that are in our building. And we also started to hear some things from around the community that made us start to think I wonder if we really need to move some people away from here. So we considered all the risks and the benefits of that. When you move a neonate, particularly one that's on a ventilator, there's almost more risk moving them than keeping them in one place. And so we really balanced some of those things out. And at the end of the day, our hospital made the decision that we are going to stay in place. The way our building is built, we can move all of our operations up except for the kitchen to the second floor. That was just serendipity. I don't think anybody thought about this situation when they were designing the building. And we can figure out a way to feed you. It won't necessarily be hot food, but we can figure out a way to feed you on the floors 2 through 5. And so we went ahead and made the decision that we were going to stay, and we let the Emergency Operations Center know that. I remember receiving that call at the EOC desk and thinking, okay, if that's what you really want. But I'm concerned about that, and I'm worried that you're going to come back to me tomorrow and tell me that you're probably going to need to evacuate. So we did work with them, but we really felt like, you know, they are an independent facility and they're going to make their own decision. And so we just continued to monitor them. So the next thing that we did start to see was we were starting to get some information from the hospitals around us in the surrounding area. Really, between Friday night and Saturday is when we really started to see the water rise in the rural areas, and we started to see search and rescue operations happening. So the Hospital 1, so that freestanding emergency department, is actually located in the hardest hit parish from this flood. And what we started to hear from them was that they had water surrounding their building. They didn't have a way to get to their physical campus. Their drive was blocked. That was in there, and they were starting to receive people that had been rescued from their homes or from some other high spot. That particular building, I told you, was just there since 2011, so it was fairly new, and it was built on the higher ground, so it really was a high spot, and it was going to be that gathering place for people in search and rescue. The problem is, while it's a big, beautiful building, it only has an emergency department. It doesn't have anything else. And the freestanding EDs that are designed in Louisiana are just-in-time everything. So it's just-in-time supplies, just-in-time meds. They don't have a kitchen. They don't have a laundry. They have a Subway, so we do have some food service in that building. Subway sandwich shop, sorry. Sorry about that. But we really, they don't have a lot of extra there. So they had the staff that they had when they went into the weekend. They had the supplies that they too felt were adequate for this thing. And then all of a sudden, all these people were being brought up in there. How they got there were by boat, by high water vehicle, occasionally by helicopter. Their helipad was still in good shape, but so they were starting to get all these people. The other hospital that's about 4 miles away from us is that acute care hospital. It was also starting to see the water rising and starting to, again, surround that as well. I'm going to show you the next couple of pictures to kind of give you a visual of what these two places looked like. The first one is that freestanding ED, and I apologize for the quality of the picture. It was taken on a cell phone out of a helicopter. It wasn't on this day, but it was just to show kind of the water had gone around this. Their central energy plant, or their facilities building with all their generators, is behind this, and there was this big swath of water between their main hospital and their energy plant. And I know that they were having some nail-biting days to try to figure out, are we losing this building too? Are we going to be in trouble? And then the next one shows you an image of Interstate 12, and that building in the upper part of the image is the second hospital that we're talking about today. As you can see, their entire campus is also covered with water. They have no road in it and out. And then I'll show you the next slide. This is a picture of their loading dock around 5 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. The water's really, really high. In their campus, this is a much older hospital. The building that's to your right, yeah, that sort of white brick building, that's where their generators are. And so they were in a really tough spot. And I remember we're having conversations with their CEO about what are we going to do? Do you feel like you can hold on a little bit longer, or do you feel like it's time to go? This hospital did make the decision to move its critical patients out of there. They felt like even if they got a couple of inches of water in there, it's not going to be safe anymore, and we need to be able to find a way to move. I didn't include them in this presentation, but I wish I had. We have several shots of their evacuation day. We had to get National Guard vehicles to go in to pick up their patients. The water was too high on their drive for an ambulance to be able to drive through, so we have adult ICU patients that we're lifting up into the back of a guard truck to bring to an ambulance staging area to bring to their next destination. And it was really compelling, and I was so proud of that hospital. They were calm, they were collected, and they made it happen, and nobody got hurt. Everybody got to the place where they needed to be. So in the next slide I'll show you, so this is our loading dock Sunday morning a little bit later. This is where we started to wonder, did we really make the best decision to stay in place, or should we have also started to move? Now, our hospital was never surrounded by water, but we were limited by the places that we could actually take our patients. We are the largest NICU in this part of the state, and probably in the state of Louisiana. It would be at least a drive to Shreveport to be able to get those babies there, and that's a really long time in an ambulance. And they aren't kids that you generally want to put on a helicopter. So we were very, very concerned about that capacity. But when we saw this Sunday morning, we thought, maybe we didn't make the best decision at all. We continued to see some staffing issues. While we weren't surrounded by water, our staff that had gone home prior in the weekend weren't able to get back because their homes were flooded or their roads were flooded, and they couldn't get to us. So we were starting to see those staffing challenges that started to affect us. So one of the things that we did at this point is we reached out to our partners at the Governor's Office of Homeland Security. That's where the Hospital Association was working from. And we said, we're really concerned about this. We're committed to staying. We feel like that's the best thing at this 5 minutes. Is there anything that you can do to help us? And one of the things that we came up with, and I'll show you just a couple other shots of our campus. One of the things that we came up with was a temporary dam. So there are a couple of different products out there. I think this one was the Aqua Dam product. But it's a big bladder that you fill with the flood water, and it creates a little tiny dam. And it's about 4 feet tall. I think at the end of the day. But what it does, it just provides you a little bit extra time to be able to accommodate the water flow. So the next slide shows you what our helipad was looking like. And this is the other reason we were starting to have some organizational anxiety. This was our retaining pond, and it's slowly inching towards the helipad. Those guys in the corner, they are actually bringing in the Aqua Dam. This was happening Sunday evening. The next slide will show you just a little bit further around on our campus where what's behind here. This picture was taken from inside the hospital building, looking down onto a receiving drive. Our emergency department is down there in the corner to the left. And so we were able to put up that Aqua Dam, that temporary dam, to be able to kind of prevent this further incursion from the retaining pond, whereas the backside of our hospital was still good. This is the retaining pond also. This is, I swear, the last picture of our retaining pond. But these are a couple of guys they were actually contractors from a building crew that we had. We were doing some construction in our hospital. What they're doing is they're looking for an outlet, and I don't know the engineering term for it, but there's a thing that goes between the loading dock that's supposed to allow water to flow from the loading dock into the retaining pond, and it was stuck. Can you believe that? So we wouldn't have had any of that water into our loading dock area, but this thing, this whatever the name of it is, this valve or this block was stuck in the closed position. So unfortunately, that's why we ended up having all that water that was in there. The other thing that I call your attention to in these little ponds, these ponds are typically about 2-3 feet deep. They are a retaining pond. They're not intended to be much more than that. These guys are really tall, and this water was probably 5 or 6 feet deep for them to be able to put their feet down in that water. By Monday, the rivers were starting to crest. We were seeing some of the water levels in the outlying areas come down. If you've ever seen river flooding, you know that sometimes it goes down in one area and comes up in another. It takes a little while to settle out. So we were still continuing to watch this and still trying to monitor to see what else we needed to be doing to be able to protect our hospital. So on the next slide, I'll show you, this is just an image that shows you what that Aqua Dam looked like. This was taken, I want to say, a couple of days later. You notice the water has receded significantly. So fortunately, in our flood, the water didn't stay with us. One of the key differences between what happened with us in this flood and, for example, a lot of people remember Hurricane Katrina. New Orleans is a big bowl, and it takes a long time for that water to come out. Our topography actually helped us here, where the water was able to recede a little bit more quickly. Still had a lot of the damage, still lost a lot of homes, but certainly not to the extent that they had that experience. So by midweek, we were starting to get an understanding of truly the scope of impact on our hospital operations and then the hospital community of this flood. For us personally, we had 532 staff who lost their homes related to flooding. A lot of our staff live away from the city. They live in these areas where we have the highest thing, and they had 6 to 8 feet of water inside their homes. It's amazing to see, breathtaking. I don't know the right descriptive word. And then after that, so once they start to get an understanding of losing their home, then we start to see the community impacts. We continue to see staffing problems because a lot of those support things that we have out there in the community were also affected by flooding. Daycares were closed for several weeks. Schools were closed for several weeks. For working parents, you need a place for your kid to be so that you can actually get to work. We also started to struggle with, we had some communication systems issues. So earlier on in the flood, a major national provider had a total outage of its network in our area. It's because their building was also affected by flooding, and their redundancies didn't work as expected. Well, those communication issues continued through the next week as they were trying to get their systems back up online. So our phones weren't working as well as they should have. Our internet wasn't working as well as it should have. It was starting to become really challenged to get through the day. The final picture that I'll show you is just a view of our hospital from the south. This is from Airline Highway, and this is the extent of our pond. So our pond made it up to Airline, but it did not cross over. I guess that's a good thing that was in there. And it just kind of shows you the extent to which we had this water near our campus and affecting travel in our area. So when we started to look back at this and to try to see, well, did we learn something? I mean, did we apply what we've learned? So in those 78 other disaster events, did we get anything from that and that made it better for us in this particular situation? And I think when we looked back at it, if we show you the next slide, we do have some very reliable systems that were in place that did help us respond well in this disaster event. We have a collaborative planning structure, and we'll talk about that a little bit more about how that evolved in our system. We have some very robust communication tools that allow us to have situational awareness and allow us to, our partners, both within our facilities and outside of our facilities, have an understanding of what's going on within our hospitals. And we have learned how to manage the resource management process. It's still not pretty, but we do know the structure, and we're able to facilitate and make that work. So let's start to talk about that collaborative planning structure. And if you go to the next slide, I'll show you. So before 2001, we had this very loose sort of, I would call us a consortium, if I call this anything, of hospitals that kind of work together for disaster response. We were very siloed. There wasn't a lot of interplay between facilities, and it was really focused on the 3 big acute care facilities in our area. And it was their readiness was focused on their business relationships with industry. So in Louisiana, we have a lot of chemical plants. Chemical plants had made great partnerships, and absolutely the correct thing to do, with the hospital that has the burn unit. Because if your injured worker in a chemical plant has a burn, that's where you want them to go, and you want them to be ready to be able to accommodate that patient. We have a nuclear power plant, so one hospital had a great relationship with them, and they were very ready from a radiological standpoint. And our state used to have something called a charity system. It was a state-funded healthcare system, and they had the trauma centers in place. And so trauma went to the charity hospital. It didn't matter if you had the ability to pay or not, but they had the expertise in trauma, and that's where you really wanted to go. So the problem came is when we have a hurricane or some other big community event that didn't fit into one of those neat little buckets. And what tended to happen is the first hospital up the road from whatever the situation was got everybody, and it was overwhelming. And we had this underutilization of some hospitals that had expertise and resources, and this overutilization and burdening of another facility that maybe did or did not have the capability to handle those kind of patients. And that was really frustrating. I think it was frustrating for us as healthcare providers, and it was frustrating for our community because the people weren't getting what they needed in a timely manner. So fast forward to what we have today. In the next slide, I'll show you this is what our network looks like today. And it's much more structured. It's it's not truly hierarchical because there is flow between the different sections. And truly, really and truly, everybody has a seat at the table. So the way we got there, this was with the advent of the HRSA funds. HRSA in 2002, I think, 2002 came out, and there was this push to have community readiness. Now, at that time, it was really about weapons of mass destruction and getting ready for the next terrorist event, and I think that all those things were well and good, but our state saw this as an opportunity for collaboration for non-terrorist events as well. And so they developed this memorandum of understanding that our hospitals, I would say 95% of the hospitals in the state agreed to participate in, that said, we agree to work together within our capacity and our capability based on what we have going on in our hospital right now. And so that was sort of, that's our foundation. That's where we started at, and that's how we agreed to work together. And you know, the system started in Katrina and in Hurricane Gustav. It wasn't completely well baked yet. It wasn't very mature. It took us a little while to figure out that we can work with our competitor during disaster, and nobody loses when we get in that situation. And over the years, over probably the last 15 years, it has really become robust. And in this flood situation, we really did a good job, I think, of working together and making sure that there was some load sharing across the community to be able to support everyone. In the next slide, I'll show you in this system, everyone has a role to play, and we have defined what those roles are. And we had to go through the exercise of talking about, like, what's my job in this disaster response? So, and we had to do that for a couple of reasons. We wanted to prevent some scope creep. So we wanted to say, as a facility, this is what I can do. This is within my scope of my license. This is my scope of my resources. State, stay back. Don't tell me how to run my hospital, because I'm in a hospital and that's what I know how to do. But I do need your help to facilitate these larger things that maybe I can't handle on my own. And so we defined it. We said, the facility, this is what our job is. We are here to receive those patients and interface directly with the community. We have designated regional coordinators, and that role is there as sort of your regional liaison. That was the role that I served as a volunteer, and we had monthly meetings. We got to know our hospitals, and my job was to make sure that their job was easy to take care of those patients, and to figure out how I can work with our parish and our state to be able to get them resources if that's what they needed to have. And then the state has a similar role, but they were at the state level, and they could interface with the federal government if and when that was needed, which in Louisiana is a lot. So if you go to the next slide, this system is based in prioritized planning. So we do try to focus on what's our biggest threat and what are the things that we think that we're going to have to use this system for. And we've been using HVAs like everybody else probably for the last 25 years. But one of the things that I think that we learned in this event, and that was our challenge, is that our top threats didn't include river flooding. Okay? No place in Louisiana does it include river flooding. We have all these rivers and bayous. You know, what makes sense with that? And I think it goes back to is having somebody else tell you that it's a disaster. We have this reliance on the named storm or someone else raising the flag to say, get ready, this is a thing, you need to start to worry about this, and that's where we get caught a little flat-footed. So the system is also, the next slide, supported with regular testing and training. In our testing and our exercises, we've really tried to focus on decision making. So less about the specific action related to the event, how to use the fire extinguisher, but more about how do I know when there's a situation there that I need to make a decision on, and giving folks the flexibility and the understanding of what they can do in a disaster event. We have found it best that when we do team training or team exercises that cross facilities, we found that really has supported our collaborative process. Something our community did in our parish in 2003, they took a group of us, hospitals, firefighters, law enforcement, government, to the Noble Training Center in Anniston, Alabama, and we did the Integrative Emergency Management course, which everyone hated. Okay, we all hated it up front, but at the end of it, it really taught us how to work together as individuals and as entities, and it showed us that, you know, we have a lot of commonalities between what we need and what we need to accomplish in this disaster event, and the resources that we have, and it works much better for us if we try to work together. Some of those things were shown. We also did some big hurricane exercises. Right before Hurricane Katrina, we did something called Hurricane Pam, which was another exercise, and it forced us to think about what's going to happen if, and we used a scenario of New Orleans having to evacuate, foreshadowing, I guess, but it forced us to actually think through what are we going to have to do in this disaster event, and it gave us some of that muscle memory to be able to implement that once we got into the situation. On the next slide, I'll show you, this is a protocol that we have that has been developed through this system. Oh my gosh, 10 minutes. Okay, a protocol that we have, get lost in myself here, that we use, and this is really around community evacuation. So this gives us a structured timeline and specific actions that we're going to have to take. When we started to worry about evacuating hospitals in our flood, we referred to this structure. We certainly didn't have 120 hours to come up with all the resources, but at least we had a methodology to be able to do that. So I have a few more slides here, but I think what I'm going to do is kind of flip forward, and I apologize to my guy in the back. I'm just going to speak off the notes that I have here, and then we'll make sure that you guys get the information. I think probably the most important thing that we've learned in the strategy that we have that's most effective for us in our collaborative structure is just that thing that we already heard about today. It's about relationships. We've spent a lot of time in the last 15 years getting to know everyone, getting to know about their hospital, about what their capacities are. We have cell phone numbers, we have email addresses, and figuring out how to work together. That's the thing that has truly helped us most to reinforce our structure. Now, there are some things that I think that we haven't been able to really solidify yet, and the things that we're really trying to refocus and maybe relearn, and one of those things is really understanding vulnerability. So in our community, I think we've always thought about physical vulnerability, and so we've done a lot to shore up our hospitals from a physical standpoint, but we hadn't really thought about what about the vulnerability if we have 30% of our staff that really can't come to work. We've thought about it in terms of pandemics. We think about that all the time, but what if it's that they physically can't come to work because of their home is damaged or they just can't get transportation? We've also need to think a little bit more about vulnerabilities in those patient groups. So we have this running list of vulnerable populations within our communities. We think about trauma and time-sensitive illness. We think about people who have chronic medical conditions who are technology dependent. Particularly in our world, we're very worried about kids who are technology dependent and ventilator dependent kids. We have some structures in our community that are there to help support them. We have a thing that's called a Pediatric Day Health Center that's in Louisiana. It provides comprehensive rehab services for these kids. And as part of their licensure in Louisiana, they have to serve as a shelter for that child and one caregiver. It's not a total solution, but at least it gets that kid out of the way and gives them a safe place to be. In the floods, we had a major issue with durable medical equipment and those small businesses that help to support that aspect of healthcare. A lot of them were damaged with the flood or couldn't get back into their business, and when we had people who had lost their equipment or it was damaged in the flood, we didn't have a good way to be able to replace that or to be able to support that. I've shared the slides with you because one of the other things that I thought was really cool that we had that came out of the floods is the East Baton Rouge Parish GIS system did some mapping using social media reports, news reports, official reports of flooding, and laid it out on the grid of the city. And what I thought was, wouldn't this be a great idea to help us understand where the vulnerabilities lie in our community and how do we use that information differently? So you may be familiar with the HHS Empower program. They can show you by volumes the people within a certain zip code that have an oxygen concentrator. It's very simple. I have to believe our private health insurers have that information too, and maybe there's a way with some analytics that we can use that to help us truly understand who's out there in our community and how do we need to prepare for that. And last, certainly not least, we need to really place some greater emphasis on the things that we're doing for recovery. So we've put a lot of energy into planning for a response and knowing when a disaster happens, and I feel like we have a fairly good structure there. But when it comes to recovery, I think we all want it to be the exercise is done, we're going to get our coffee, we have a dance recital to go to, we have something else, and we're just done with that. We're not going to think about it anymore. And I think with our floods, we learned that that's just not the case. Recovery is a very long-term proposition. It takes us several months. As a matter of fact, December of 2018, we still had people in supported housing because they didn't have a home to be able to go back to. Recovery is hindered by contractor fraud and issues. You are a ripe target when you lose your home because you just want to get back, and people will take advantage of that. We had one person who was convicted of, I want to say, 160 counts of fraud related specifically to the flood. It's awful, but those people are out there, and unfortunately, they're not going to go away. We also wanted to look at how do we reinforce some of our community safety net. In this flood, our food bank was flooded. They lost their inventory, as was the Salvation Army shelter and store. So they're two major players in how we support the folks that are vulnerable every day, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it for months because they just didn't have a building or the resources to be able to do that. And the final comment I'll leave you with is the last thing I think that we're worrying about as a healthcare preparedness community is about sustainability. So as we all cycle out, so I'm in a new job now, I've been doing something different, we're all kind of cycling out of these roles that we've had for 15, 20 years now, where we're developing this network of how we work together, and we're wondering is how can we sustain this? Have we done a good enough job in terms of succession planning, of teaching the people that are filling our roles after us, our new CEOs, so that they can carry on this mission and carry on this structure that we have? I was so pleased when I heard our CEOs during this flood working with a new CEO in the area, telling them, this is how it works. This is how we're going to help you. I have this resource. Do you need this? How can we work together? That was wonderful to hear because I was there in the beginning when they wouldn't even talk to each other. So 15, 20 years later, they're able to do that. But, so I feel like there's hope for that, but I think we need to be very methodical about how we plan for that. Or in another 20 years, we're going to be back where we started from. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good job.
Thank you.
Good job. So once again, reminder, we have microphones around the room, so please don't be bashful.
Which side would you like me to be on? Sorry about
Whatever
that.
side you would like. Do you have a better side?
I don't know. You all tell me.
So please, whatever questions you have, come on forward so Allyn can answer them. So the first question I got to ask you, did the guys find the plug?
Yes, they did.
Excellent. Excellent. And do we make sure that the plug is now properly lubed
It is in the correct position now, so thank God. I think everyone was a little frustrated at that point. So hats off to them for getting into the water, though.
So let's play off the conversation Eric and I were having earlier about the media. How did you use the media in this to your advantage?
So in this situation, it was really important for us to communicate how our status, where are we open, what do we want, what don't we want to have happen within our hospitals. And so we have a public information officer in place at every one of these hospitals. So most of our hospitals have implemented incident command, and always they have a PIO that's available. The PIOs were working together to share information about their individual facilities. Our hospital, in addition, was using social media where we could. We have a pretty strong Facebook presence, and so they were pushing messages out about this is our status as a hospital, this is what we know about this shelter that's open, these are some resources that you want. Moms that have just gone home with a new baby into a flood situation are a little anxious, understandably, and so we wanted to be that support for them.
Great. Just a show of hands, how many feel like they have a good social media presence at their organizations? How many feel it could be better? There we go. Okay. All right. Yes, please.
Yes, ma'am.
So sort of, I don't know if this is on.
Yep.
Okay. So going off even your last comment about moms with anxiety.
Yeah.
If I'll take off my emergency management hat and put on my mom hat, I would have been freaking out watching that water come up to the hospital. What sort of family support were you offering to parents who had kids in the NICU?
So one of the things that we did do that is not something we would typically do. So we don't typically allow families to just stay with us. It just gets to be a little overwhelming with that many people. But we did allow parents to stay within their kids. So if they could get to us, we did allow one caregiver. So we had to balance out that need. A lot of times these are families that have multiple kids. And so we had to balance out to say, well, this is the resource that we have, and we know you want to be there with your baby, but we can't have the other 2 kids here. So how can we help you to figure out a place for them to be? For the most part, that worked. There's always an exception that happened. The other thing that we did is moms that were that had delivered, but they were concerned about going home, is we just kept them a little bit longer. So don't tell anybody that we did that. But we did offer, and to be candid, we did tell the state that we were going to do that. We're just not going to discharge them. We're just going to hold them for another day and try to work with them on resource planning so that they have a safe place to go home to. One of the biggest challenges in this flood is we didn't always know whether or not your home was okay. Just because it's hard to get information, and when the roads are flooded, you can't just send a truck out there to go check. So that was one of the things that we did.
So let's talk for a moment about your employees. 532 staff lost their homes.
Correct.
What other steps did the hospital take to help employees through this crisis?
Sure. For the staff that who affected that direct impact of flooding, we did a couple of things. We allowed them extra flexibility for their staffing schedules. So we worked with our managers. Everybody got to carry a little bit of the load, but we did give them a little bit more time to be able to go out and do the cleanup in their homes, assess the damages. We helped them with their paperwork, working with the insurance company. Working with insurance on a day-to-day basis is overwhelming, and then when you have this stress that's there. So we did some of that physical part as well. In addition, a lot of them had lost their scrubs. They didn't have anything to wear to work. So we did scrub drives and food drives, and then we did, the hospital association hosted an employee assistance fund. So we got donations from a lot of hospitals across the country, as well as within our own community, that gave a financial stipend back to those people that had lost their homes, and that went across the community. It wasn't a whole lot of money, but a little bit of money at this time helps tremendously.
How long did it take the community to get back to what you might call normal?
Well, in Louisiana, nothing's normal, just so you know.
That was a setup question.
That was. Thank you very much. We like it that way.
That's right.
But truly, I think most businesses were back in operation, and within about the first year to 18 months, the businesses that could come back. We are still seeing people today rebuilding their homes. A friend of mine at Women's Hospital who lost her home, her mom had lived with her for the last year and a half. They just got mom back into her own house, and her house closed, I want to say last month. She was finally able to get all the repairs done, and she's able to get back into her home. It takes a really long time to do that rebuilding.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about the decision that was made to stay. Because it sounded to me, as I was listening to you, that perhaps the decision was made, but were all the different considerations. We need to remember this is going to be on YouTube,
yeah,
okay? So your boss could
Sorry, I'm
see
listening.
this. But,
Yeah,
but the idea of how much of a role did you feel you got to play in that, in terms of bringing up the risk issues involved?
So in my role, I was at the Hospital Association during the flood. And so we were mostly advocates and consultants when it comes to an individual facility. So in our network, facilities are still independent. They operate their business, and that we work with them to support them in the decisions that they've made and the resources that they need. So in our role in this particular flood, we work directly with the administrators at Women's Hospital and in the other hospitals to talk through them about the specific challenges that with staying in place versus evacuating. A lot of us had been around since Katrina, and so we'd seen some of those evacuations happen, and so we were able to refer to that lovely slide that I left y'all with, was that timeline to say, well, let's think about how many people do you have, What are your where are they going to go? Where are those kids going to go? Where are those adults going to go? How far away is that? And so we would work the math at the Emergency Operations Center to say, well, how long is it going to take us to get there, and what are we going to need to be able to do that? Is there a National Guard or other helicopter that's equipped to be able to put an isolette in that can move to this location? Is that really the thing? And so we tried to work with them as specifically as that. The folks at Women's Hospital are the experts in neonatal care and in women's services, and so we defer to them for their expertise, but we did try to point out some things that we had learned from previous events to help them think through the problem.
Were you satisfied?
Absolutely, but I was very anxious. I don't think I slept at all until the water went round. I think they did make a good decision. It's always easy to look back and say they should have done something differently. But based on the information that they had, based on the resource and the leadership they had, I think they made the right decision. Yep. And I think the hospital that did move, I think they made the right decision for them as well. It was just a different one based on their scenario.
And maybe you said this, but I missed it, was how often do you drill this network, the roles and responsibilities? How often does that take place?
The exercise, the ESF8 network is drilled at least once a year. We do that through typically a hurricane scenario, since that's what we're most familiar and comfortable with, typically in April, and they do a full-scale community-wide exercise where we are walking the process and making sure that we understand how the communication systems work, how the decisions are going to be made. Individually within the regions, they'll do regional exercises, and I want to say it's annually, and it may center on a different scenario, again, where they're going to work the process and verify phone numbers and verify how we're going to communicate and how we're going to use those communication tools to show capacity. So it's done fairly frequently.
Okay. Please feel free to come up and ask questions. I can continue, but I also don't want to take away anyone. We see a gentleman coming forward who is waiting to ask this question. Could you identify yourself and then your question, please?
Absolutely. Oh, boy. No dice? Oh, there we go. My name is Patrick Kelly. I'm from the Lee Health System. A little out of my region here, but I wanted to ask you, from being both in hospital and on the regional side, about business continuity in the hospitals. And you talk about even just saying your communication system. You know, you had multiple employees not able to get to work. You had a major communications company that didn't have service. Did you find any issues with any of the facilities having problems with purchasing authority, decision making, any of those high-level functions that they just couldn't perform because they weren't able to get in touch with people that were making those decisions and didn't have appropriate plans in place to deal with that?
So we did not experience any of that particular type of challenge in this event. So we found that for the most part, people were able to access their vendor. If they needed a resource to be brought in or to some sort of support that was in there, they didn't have those challenges happening there. Where we ran into it was when they had a resource or a decision, a resource that they didn't have. For example, in our hospital within the Aqua Dam, being able to get that temporary dam, there's no hospital that has one of those. So there was no way that we could share between facilities. That's not going to be on a hospital's primary contract list that's in there. And so we actually had to go escalate through and work with the state directly to be able to get that purchased. That is an amazing feat that occurred. So we actually requested that. I want to say it was installed on Sunday, so we were requesting that sometime on Saturday as we were talking about this thing. And the state was able to implement its purchasing rules to be able to access that and purchase that on our behalf. I don't know if that was technically part of the plan, but it did work out for us that was in there. In case anybody's wondering, there is a bill when you access resources that way, and we did pay for the Aqua Dam service that came back for us, Aqua Dam device that was in there. We were fortunate that our property insurance had some mitigation funds in there, and we were able to file a claim through there to be able to offset some of the costs that we were doing that. Our CEO was directly involved in that conversation, in that purchase, because of the special nature of what it was. So I hope that answers your question.
Has everyone reacted, has everyone taken this seriously, the key players, and even you said like the food bank, things like that? Or are people seeing this as, it's the 100-year flood, we'll never see this again? We have something here in Massachusetts that we call the blizzard of '78. And whenever there are flurries, people run to the store to buy bread and milk.
Yeah.
Can't quite figure it out, but that's what happens. And also no one in Massachusetts knows how to drive in the
Sure.
snow. But other than that,
We don't know how to drive in ice, just so you know. If we get ice in
That's
Louisiana, the
understandable,
state
though.
shuts down. But so I think there's a mixed bag. I think from the community level, from the agency level, we're taking this seriously. We want to believe the statistic that says this is 1 in 1,000, and we've got another 500 years before this happens again. But we understand that there have been a lot of changes to the state related to development. There's climate changes going on, and we know that we're probably ripe for another event in less time frame than that. But there's also there's the psychology of that, and there's some self-protection that says, we lived through this once. The last time this flooded like this was 35 years ago. I'm not going to have to do this again. And that's where I think one of our calls is, as a community, is how do we get our citizens, where they're thinking about this as a threat. It took us a long time to get people to evacuate from the coast ahead of a hurricane. For a long time, people who had survived Hurricane Camille or Betsy in the 50s, they said, this is nothing, I'm going to stay here. And unfortunately, we lost a lot of those people. They didn't survive the events that happened sooner. And so I don't know. So you hear that some of the folks that said, well, you know what, my property didn't flood in 30 years ago. It didn't flood this time. It's not going to ever happen to me. And somehow we need to bridge that gap for them, because I don't think I'm concerned that they won't be ready when they need to be.
so as a risk manager, what keeps you up at night? You talked about vulnerability, but what really keeps you up at night?
The biggest thing for me is truly being able to have the resources and the systems in place to take care of the patient that's in front of us. And as a risk manager in disaster events, that's what concerns me the most. We know what our vulnerable groups are. We just don't know the scope of the problem. So we know that we have a challenge with people who are electrically dependent or technology dependent, all these great devices. In healthcare, we've pushed people back home again, which is wonderful. I think they get healthier faster. They don't have to be in the hospital. But a consequence of that is they are more dependent on these things, and they may not have the systems in place at home to be able to support themselves. I remember a story from Hurricane Gustav where we really, the focus was on oxygen. We had a lot of people on oxygen concentrators at home. And when it's hot in Louisiana, you can't breathe. And when you're running out of power on your oxygen concentrator, it's a very bad mix. And so we really pushed our parish to say, we need a place for you to set up the oxygen tanks for people to come to be able to refill their home tank and get a place of respite and have some cool air. And they were able to do that for us in Hurricane Gustav. So I don't know what that looks like now. I mean, as our healthcare systems are evolving, as our community's evolving, I don't know what those supports are there. We know who the groups are. We just now have to figure out a way to support them.
My last question is, I actually had to Google this because the name of your hospital is Woman's Hospital.
Correct.
And when I saw and what was said to me, I said, I'm going to just double check the spelling, that it's not Women's Hospital. So tell us how Woman's Hospital came to be.
Well, our hospital, Women's Hospital, was founded by a group of physicians in the 50s. 1958 was when we were officially started. And there's a very long story, but I know we're out of time. But the short story is these physicians and our early CEOs believed that our care should be about the patient that's in front of us, about that one woman. We love all women, absolutely, but that one woman that's in front of us, that's who we should be focusing on. And so that's why they named it Women's Hospital. So it's for the individual.
That's something for you to chew on at lunch.
Yeah.
All right, Allyn, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.